The vault door fought her until the last inch. Metal rasped, a low hum rising from within like a buried throat clearing after decades of dust. She braced, pushed, and felt cold air breathe against her face. Ink, stone, forgotten years. Rumor said a legacy slept under this collapsed courthouse. Others had tried to wake it and never returned. Footsteps scraped above, intruders hunting the same prize. The lock clenched once, almost warning. Time was running out. Subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Then stay with her. As the door closed behind her, the vault swallowed the light, and the hum deepened. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long decayed hay. Wrong in a courthouse, but rot migrates. Paper carries perfume across centuries. She steadied her breath. The weight of history sat heavy in her hands. A flashlight, a folded blueprint, and her field notebook, whose edges had absorbed rain and resolve in equal measures. She didn't come for treasure. She wanted a document rumored to transfer a forgotten civic legacy, wells, schools, a burial ground, back to the town's descendants. Midnight was the filing deadline. If she failed, the legacy would revert to a private estate, with lawyers like blades. The world beyond this sub-basement had collapsed in a past winter. Down here, the building still remembered its purpose. Corridors pinwheeled into shadows, stacks leaned like tired men. Cables sagged. Signs whispered, Annex B, probate, deeds. Her blueprint, sepia, frayed, mapped a labyrinth the living no longer trusted. Faded conduit lines threaded through the walls, and she followed them, breadcrumb by breadcrumb, a pilgrim of copper and chance. She found the first clue in a drift of paper husks, a brass registry plate, green with corrosion, stamped with a serifed pride the modern world had forgotten. Annex C, Legacy Vault. The plate was bolted to nothing, as if the wall had moved to protect itself. She ran a thumb across its letters and felt childhood rise, a memory of tracing embossed metal on library plaques, believing names could be touched back to life. The conduit ribbed left. She moved with it, testing boards with the toe of her boot, counting breath against the hush. At a locked junction, she paused. The door bore no handle, only a recessed panel and an emblem, 2 crossed keys and a sheaf of wheat. The emblem was familiar. It had appeared once before, pressed in red wax on the document she wasn't allowed to read. It also lived, faint and proud, on the cover of her own field notebook. She had stamped it there on a dare to herself. Earn this. She tried codes the archive once used, date of incorporation, founding slogan, the year the courthouse burned and rose again, each failing with a polite chime that felt like mockery. The panel blinked, patient. She slid the brass registry plate beneath her palm like a talisman and listened. The hum behind the door wasn't electrical alone. It had the cadence of a machine that remembered its duty. She pressed her notebook to the panel, the emblem on its cover aligned beneath her fingers. Something in the circuitry recognized pattern or faith. The screen brightened, then dimmed, then printed a sentence across a thin glass line. Living countersignature required. She didn't speak at first. The phrase sat inside her like a cold coin. Living, not legal. Breath, not ink. She thought of the rumor, that the first archivist had promised this vault would only open for someone who chose people over power, and that choice would leave a mark. Footsteps scuffed above, closer now. She placed her hand over the emblem. The glass warmed, a pulse under her palm, measuring what she could not tell. The machine listened as she said her name, then the names of the town's founding wards, the creek that fed the first mill, the schoolhouse that burned. She spoke as if she were calling roll. The panel flickered. Rejected. Then, add co-witness. The words settled like ash. She had no one with her. No official seal, no notary, no ally, only memory and an inherited stubbornness. Time was running thin. She pulled back, scanning walls for a second route. Conduits threaded into darkness. A gap between shelves opened onto a narrow corridor whose floor sloped like a throat. The map did not show it. The air down there held a fainter hum, as if the building whispered around a corner. She went. The corridor narrowed until her shoulders brushed cold stone. On the right, a strip of painted numbers ticked downward. 03, 02, 01, 00. At the landing, an alcove waited. Iron lattice, frosted glass. A forgotten service window with a speaking tube that smelled of oil and breath. A mechanism clicked once, and a recorder coughed to life somewhere deeper, a brittle spool turning. She leaned toward the tube. Is Annex C on this line? The answer wasn't a voice. It was a vibration through the rail. 3 short pulses, 1 long. Not Morse. Older. A municipal rhythm. Tax quarter, levy, release. She remembered an anecdote from an oral history. Clerks tapping pipes when the phones died during a flood. The archive had a body. She learned its heartbeat. Back at the locked door, she tapped the rail in the same pattern against the panel's edge, 3 short, 1 long. Then the founding year, 1 digit at a time, drummed into metal. The light warmed from cold blue to a faint wheat amber, as if the emblem itself exhaled. A slit opened. Air sighed, dry and archival. Not enough for entry, but enough to believe. The panel printed a second line. Witness present. She froze. Her reflection stared back in the glass, tired eyes, dust on her cheek, a smudge she hadn't earned yet. Then, faint through the wall, the recorder's click traveled like a footstep, and in that small mechanical certainty, she understood the witness the vault required. A living ear, willing to remember. If you will keep what I find, she said into the seam, I will give it to the people it belongs to. Metal shifted. Bolts rolled like a slow throat clearing. The door refused her still, but its resistance felt like tradition, not denial. The echo of her last failed code faded into the stacks, and deeper inside, a recorder clicked alive. 1 more spool, 1 more test, 1 more whisper waiting its turn. As the door settled back into its stubborn quiet, she followed the hum toward the recorder's click. The corridor bent into a chamber lined with alcoves, each holding a register bound in cracked leather. The air was cooler here, thinner, as if the room rationed breath. On a central plinth lay relic number 2. A ledger so large it seemed intended for 2 clerks to lift together. Sepia pages bowed under their own gravity. Edges were serrated where names had been cut out, leaves torn with careful violence. She set her palm on the cover. The leather warmed, as if remembering hands. Inside, the ink marched in columns. Head of household, trade, tax paid, civic duty. Then a wound where names should be. The tears left silhouettes of letters like shadows of birds flown. A pencil note in the gutter pinned her. A town survives by the names it remembers. Signed with a faded initial, the same she had traced on her field notebook without admitting why it steadied her. She scanned page after page. Every excised name corresponded to a small circle stamped faintly in the margin, a circle within a gear, lock wheel marks. She looked up. The far wall was not a wall. It was a mechanism disguised as masonry. 12 recessed sockets arranged in a ring, each missing a brass bolt the size of a thumb. The missing bolts matched the missing names. The truth was worse than rumor. Someone had erased people on paper and stripped the machine that promised to keep them. A narrow brass horn protruded from the ring's center. She leaned close and heard the hush of old circuitry. The horn tasted of metal and breath. A plate below it bore instructions in worn script. Speak the honored, the wheel will hear. Dialect enforcement active, 3 errors, triggers, purge. She felt the railing under her hand. Cool, steady. She wanted proof. She needed proof. The town's descendants needed more than faith. Time was running out, but time had already been stolen from these names. She chose the first incision, M, the rest torn away. Beside the cut, a notation read, Spinner. Not a trade, a label. She thought of mill records and the way dialect bent vowels along the creek. She tried the name that should be there. Marakinney, she said into the horn, letting the vowels shorten as she had heard them in oral histories. Kinne. The mechanism stirred. A tooth inside the ring clicked forward 1 notch, a shallow but undeniable advance. The amber light along the emblem warmed, then steadied. From deeper in the walls came a low chime, not celebratory, but acknowledging. Her throat tightened. The ledger was a roll call of people the town chose to forget. She had just brought one back into the room. She moved to the next torn space. A margin note read, Boyer, with a curious diacritic, like a comma resting above the Y. She thought of a French surname, baked into prairie English, and the way elders said it, with a half-swallowed O. She tried, softening the middle. Boyer, Boyer. The horn shivered. The ring advanced a 2nd notch. Somewhere behind the wall, another door stirred. A heavy panel flexing against age, the floor beneath her feet taking on a faint, slow vibration. The complication arrived like cold on the back of the neck. The 3rd socket waited. The ledger showed only fragments. Ra. Ez. The remainder gouged out with intent. Public records would list a spelling polished by power. That was the point. Polish until a lineage slipped. The horn glinted, patient and merciless. The plate's warning about purge hung in the air like frost. She ran her finger along the paper and felt something the eye could not see. Indentations, where a clerk's hand had pressed too hard on the next page as they worked. She tilted the ledger toward her light, exhaled, and watched breath lift ink that was almost gone. Ghost letters rose, R-E-Z, then the faint tail of a diacritic, gone to a dot. She knew this hand, the same angled stroke that had left the note, the same impatient tail on every S, the same initial that signed the margin, an initial the rumor tied to the first archivist. Anger steadied her. The truth was worse, she whispered. You rewrote them until they vanished. She studied the glyphs drawn faintly in the ledger's header, 3 name glyphs remaining, 3 sockets empty. 3 errors, triggers, purge. The wheel did not care why a vowel broke. It cared only that breath held shape. She swallowed dryness. She lifted the horn and let memory braid with method. Names of streets that had been private drives. Names sanded into brand slogans. Names spoken at kitchen tables and nowhere else. Time was running out. Footsteps above shifted from exploratory to intentional. Metal on stone. Intruders growing bold. Rege, she tried. The zh softened as her grandmother said it once when reading a headstone. The easy, not as in easy, but as in ode. Res. The mechanism hesitated, as if judging fidelity. Then the ring ticked, reluctant, accepting. The horn warmed against her lips. A soft voice bled from the brass. A recorder, repeating her pronunciations back to her, testing for drift. She listened to her own breath return altered by the chamber. The room was not merely opening. It was teaching, or exacting debt. The mechanism of debt demanded paid interest in attention. The ledger's weight pressed into her forearm. She turned another page and found a margin line in the same hand as the initial. If they erase the names, the town defaults. Find the bolts, fit the speech, make the ledger remember. A small symbol sat beside the note, a circle split by a river line. The crest from Annex C, but altered. Custodian, not owner. Her throat ached. She set the ledger down, touched the ring, and felt the faintest give as the gear reached a point of balance. One socket remained. She knew without reading that the last name would be the one warped worst by the years, the one turned into a joke in schoolyards so children would stop asking who they were. She lifted the horn again. "Call them back," she said to the room, to herself, to whatever witness the vault recognized. Hold them long enough to write them down. The floor thrummed once, deeper than before. Another door woke in the bones of the building, somewhere she had not yet seen. The corridor answered with a long, low exhale. The last notch waited. As the corridor's exhale faded, she followed the new vibration into a wing the blueprint never named. The door ahead bore no letters, only a thin slit like a listening wound. When she pushed, it yielded with reluctant grace. Inside, sound lived in the walls. Index drawers climbed from floor to ceiling, cedar fronts worn smooth by vanished hands. Each hummed at a slightly different pitch, a choir of low notes that braided into one careful, relentless tone. The air smelled of wax, ink, and breath sealed long ago. She stepped closer. A drawer near her knee thrummed in recognition, then stilled, as if deciding whether she was worth its voice. She touched the handle. The metal was cool, honest. A placard read, "Echoes, Civic Acts, Witnessed." Another drawer answered with a brighter hum, labeled "Debts, Unpaid Promises." The room was simple enough to misunderstand. You could catalog a life here and think the work complete, but the weight in her chest said different. A chamber like this did not collect stories. It enforced them. She slid the first drawer. Inside, spools rested in cradles, wax cylinders with paper collars. On one, a neat label in faded graphite. Transfer Protocol. Custody of Legacy. Relic number 3. Waiting where rumor promised. She lifted it. The paper collar crackled in her fingers, a small, honest sound. She set the cylinder into a horned recorder on a stand that rose to her height like a lectern that remembered sermons. The machine woke with a cough of static. Then a woman's voice, no accent for television, only the valley's vowels, clean and unsmoothed. Custody of legacy. Protocol requires living declaration. Custodian must name service of the legacy, people or power. Warning. False declaration voids all claims. Witness status. Ambient. The word ambient settled on her skin. The vault would accept the room itself as witness if she spoke, but the room did not forgive. The voice continued, patient as a clerk at closing time. To proceed, pay the debt pledged by the first archivist. A promise left unpaid accrues interest. There it was. The mechanism of debt moved beyond names. It pressed its thumb into the soft part of intention. She stared at the horn. People, she said, before her doubt could theater it. The room responded with a low, approving tone. Then the protocol's voice sharpened. Proof required. Offer a story of restitution bearing your name. Ambient witness will countersign. The shelves vibrated gently, like a throat clearing in anticipation. She closed her eyes and let herself return to a hallway that had smelled of ammonia and sunlight. She had been 20 then, stubborn and too sure that accuracy could heal. A family Bible had come into her hands through a chain of auctions and estate sales. The owner on paper was rich with permissions. The owner, in truth, was a woman who had once traced her grandfather's name on Sundays until the page softened under grief. She remembered knocking on a stranger's door with the book wrapped in her coat, the woman's hands shaking as she touched the leather, the way the house fell silent after the first name was spoken out loud. She had signed nothing that day. She had left with no receipt. But when she walked away, the air around her had changed weight. She spoke that story, not with polish, with details that could only come from carrying the book across town in rain and fear. The machine listened, then asked with gentle cruelty, "What did you lose?" She inhaled. A collector's goodwill, a chance at a job that said the world runs on invoices, and a point on my own pride. Silence held. Then the drawers hummed higher, a warmth the room had withheld until now. The recorder clicked, stamping the cylinder with a mark she could not see but could feel deep in the air. Somewhere back in the annex, a bolt rolled home. One lock yielded. She replaced the cylinder, like a relic back into a reliquary. The hum resolved into a single, steady note she knew she would hear in her sleep. She turned to go, but the room wasn't done. A second drawer slid open by its own will, spilling a faint whisper into the air. A life vignette. Her first instinct was to close it. Too many voices here could drown her, but the whisper wasn't a story. It was instruction, disguised as memory. A clerk, decades gone, speaking to a young assistant. When the choice feels easy, you are probably being bribed. She almost laughed, but the room absorbed sound like a ledger absorbs excuse. She let the drawer shut. She had what she needed. The price was set, and for once, it felt fair. As she reached the threshold, a strap of light ran along the baseboards. A thin radiance, like a seam in stone giving up. The building's spine responded with a distant, metallic groan, the kind old bridges make when the first thaw arrives. It traveled under her boots and up through her teeth. Annex C heard her declare, and some part of the vault decided to meet her halfway. She paused at the door and spoke, not for machines, but for the witness she had invoked. I've named the side I serve. Hold me to it. The chamber softened, its chorus resolving into the quiet you feel after an oath. She stepped back into the corridor. Behind her, the echo room closed itself with a neat librarian click. Ahead, dust lifted in a single drift, as if a large thing had begun to move, slow and ceremonial. Far above, footsteps shifted from confident to cautious. The intruders felt the change too. Time narrowed. The price had been paid. Interest would no longer compound. Now the names would ask for what they were owed. As the dust settled from the vault's slow shift, the corridor tightened around her focus. 3 name glyphs remained on the ledger's header, 3 sockets in the lock wheel, still empty. The warning on the plate, 3 errors triggers purge, pressed against her ribs like a band. She wiped her palms on her coat and returned to the horn. The wheel waited, poised between grace and erasure. Tension braided with purpose. If she failed here, the archive's core would wipe its memory. Names, protocols, witness logs, everything reduced to silence by design. Above, the intruder's footsteps multiplied, angling toward the annex. The vault sensed proximity. The hum recalibrated, the cadence of a clock that had quickened. She turned to a page warped by water. The ink bled into gray blooms, vowels drowned, consonants floating like driftwood. Candle soot chewed the lower margin. She tilted her light, breathed shallow to lift what the paper could still give. A surname survived in half-strokes. Turl. A diacritic slashed and smeared into a bruise. The gutter note read, Washer, Creekside, then dissolved. She mapped the dialect in her head, the creek's old voice thinning long vowels into wire. Tarell, she tried, letting the E flatten into a Nera, the R softened by wet air. The horn vibrated, then recoiled. A cold tone cut the room. The wheel ticked backward a fraction. First strike. She swallowed heat. Error 1. 2 left before purge. The room did not threaten, it enforced. She steadied, ran her fingertip along the torn edge, felt the bite of a clerk's blade where haste had ruled. She listened to the creak in memory, to how elders lost the middle vowel when they were tired. Trull, she whispered to herself, testing mouth against habit. But the horn waited for certainty, not rehearsal. She set that name aside. Not yet. Second attempt. The next missing glyph sat under a column marked Debt Forgiven, blank where grace should be recorded. A faint pencil arrow pointed to an end paper that had been glued down. She flicked a nail under the seam and lifted. An annotation bled through from beneath, letters reversed like a mirror in a shallow pond. She held the leaf to her light. Strokes resolved. A forename with an X in the middle, uncommon here. A surname ending in Vic, written with a cramped hand unfamiliar with its cadence. She drew breath and tried a common mispronunciation in this valley, the one that made Slavic endings buckle into Vic. Aleksevich, she said, quick, clipped, wrong on purpose to test the machine's ear. The horn answered with nothing, no acceptance, no strike. It waited. Her mouth tasted of rust. The ledger and the room both demanded care, not performance. She exhaled through her nose, slowed. She thought of the old blueprint she had folded into her coat, the note in the margin that lifted ink when warmed by breath. She leaned closer and breathed across the page. The thin letters glistened. A faint diacritic on the C flickered back to life, a soft tale that changed everything. Alekseyevich, she spoke into the horn, stress on the second syllable. The C softened toward SH. The wheel advanced with relief, a full notch dropping solidly into place. The floor gave a small, approving thrum. One socket remained. One strike banked. 2 lives restored to audible. Her throat ached with the effort to listen as fiercely as she spoke. Complication rose like a hand from under ice. The last name had been intentionally falsified in the public roll, a clerk's flourish, bending a family into a brand that would never match the machine's memory. Here, in the ledger's wound, only indentations lived. The margin bore the same initial she had followed through the archive, the same impatience, curving like a question. The hand that wrote her field notebook's note had also stood here, hiding and hinting at once. She angled the page, let the light skim, let her breath lift dust. Indentations surfaced like constellations, the faint downstroke of an H, the soft rise of an E given too much ink, the long tail of an L cut short by a tear. She brushed the opposite page. There, on the next sheet, the trace of pressure formed a ghost name in reverse. She set her notebook beside the ledger, the cover's emblem touching the old crest like cousins across a table. The vault sensed the alignment. The hum underfoot accelerated. Above, footsteps broke into a run. Metal hit stone. Voices sharpened. The countdown tightened its loop around her ribs. She attempted the creekside washer again, feeling the creak cool her mouth, letting the vowels narrow. Trill, she said this time. The A gone. The R rolled less. The ending clipped by work. The horn considered, then granted a small chord, not a chime. The ring did not move. Noted, perhaps. Not wrong. Not right. She returned to the falsified record. The public spelling, plastered on a mill sign she'd cursed as a child, was Helen. The double L punching through silence, the E flattened. She had laughed at the sign then, not knowing she was laughing at a theft. The indentations told another shape. Helen, accent bare as a vein. A breath stirred a final line where a diacritic should have been, but had been erased by deliberate fingers. Everything changed when she found the next page's corner notched, an archivist's field trick for see-through. She slid a thin sheet beneath and rubbed with the side of her pencil. The name rose in graphite, shy but present. Helen Rez, she tried, giving the last consonant the softness it wanted, the Z humming like a hive at dusk. The wheels shuddered. A heavy bar inside the wall withdrew a finger's width, then halted, poised on edge. The room waited on one more syllable, as if the name were longer than the town had allowed. Her pulse climbed. She traced the indentation again, lower this time, where a hyphen waited like a hand held out. A house name. A union of lines the record had severed. The next letters lifted. River. Not English river, the old word for the creek the town had renamed, written in a tongue the first plat maps called foreign, now the language of water under stone. She swallowed, leaned into the horn, and spoke the full line the room had been guarding. Helen Rez River. The second word, shaped in the cadence her grandmother had used at funerals, where names were heavy and final. The wheel turned, not a notch. A rotation. The missing socket filled with a sound, metal settling into its patience. The smaller hatch below the emblem sighed open on unseen hinges, the breath of a tired confession escaping. Somewhere above, a startled curse skittered along tile. She released the horn and pressed her palm to the ring's skin. Warmth lived there now. The room had accepted the payment, attention, risk, a strike survived. The purge stayed its hand. The archive remembered itself again, one turn closer to honesty. Hold, she whispered to the machine, to the names, to the witness she had invoked. I'm still here. The corridor answered with a quiet that felt like trust. The smaller hatch breathed open and revealed a chamber no blueprint had admitted existed. The air shifted to parchment and cold stone. Inside, a sealed folio rested on a cradle of oak, ribbon intact, the wax seal bearing the Annex C emblem intertwined with an unfamiliar crest. A circle split by a river line, the wheat sheaf reduced to witness rather than crown. She slid the folio toward her with both hands. The weight felt ceremonial. She slipped a knife beneath the ribbon and lifted, careful not to scar the paper. Pages unfolded in a script that married legal rigor to human plea. Ledgers of endowments, mill tithes, a school fund diverted in small siphons until a century's river ran into a private trust. Margins carried annotations in that same impatient hand. See also burial ground plot assessments. See also pump station hollow. She read with a hunter's focus. The transfer instrument was clear. Once the custodian restored the record, the legacy returned to public ownership immediately. Site, stacks, annex, everything that held the names. A clause nested beneath in smaller type, a hinge the careless would miss. Restoration triggers immediate public custody of the site and records. All barriers and liens void at once. Her breath calmed for a beat. Then the second clause lifted its cold face. Before transfer completion, record oral witnessing within the vault. Failure to record voids the act at expiration of current day. It wanted a voice now, not later, not by affidavit. Living countersignature, made audible. Metal shifted in the corridor overhead, intruders breaching a guardrail. She set the folio on the lectern beside a horn wired into the wall, a twin to the Echo Room's machine, but older. She unrolled a thin sheet tucked at the back, a list of names in a cadence that read like a bell schedule. The protocol cylinder by the horn pulsed, ready. She spoke, not quickly. Each name rang like iron struck clean. Mara Kinney. The horn recorded and played it back with a faint shimmer, filing it in the vault's throat. Boyer. The tone deepened. Alexevich. The room's hum synchronized, the glow in the emblem settling to wheat amber, the river crest holding steady. She continued, moving through the list with the care one uses reading the dead aloud. With each name, the cadence gathered a muscle beneath the floor. The vault answered by lighting a string of lamps she hadn't seen, a line that ran along the baseboards like dawn through boards. Above, metal on stone stuttered into a rhythm, boots, then a crowbar. The horn did not hurry. She added Helen Res River, letting the hyphen do its quiet work, and the air around her felt less like a room and more like a throat readying to sing. She paused at a crest stamped beside the final paragraph. It matched the unfamiliar seal, circle split by river. A line beneath, in the same brisk hand as the margin notes, custodian signs here. She traced the inked surname that followed, and a quiet truth rose like a tide. Letters shaped with the same pressure as the field notebook's note, the same initial, the same curve at the end of the S. The first archivist had signed not as owner, but as custodian, and the initial matched hers, not blood, duty. The room warmed to that comprehension. She felt herself steady, not with triumph, but with a burden that fit her grip. She sealed the witnessing with the horn's closing line, people, not power. breathing it as oath, not slogan. The cylinder clicked, carving a groove that felt final. Somewhere overhead, alarms stuttered, then faltered. The vault accepted her voice as the present tense it required. The floor answered with a slow ceremonial clatter, the sound of stowed ladders unhooking. A square of ceiling slid aside and lowered a narrow iron ladder into the chamber's far wall, rungs shining with oil that smelled of thyme and cedar. The emblem brightened once, then returned to its wheat amber breathing, as if saying, "It's your turn." She tucked the folio inside her coat against her ribs, where the hum could find her heartbeat. The horn gave a last, sympathetic vibration. She took the ladder with careful hands, each rung a small ledger balanced against consequence. Above, the passage opened into a slit of corridor that angled toward whatever the vault considered a final chamber. She glanced back at the lectern. The protocol cylinder spun down, a gentle diminuendo. The names she had spoken lingered in the air like steam fading from a cup. She understood, with a clarity that made her throat tighten, that the recording was not simply proof. It was a garment the names could wear to leave this room. She climbed. The iron was cold, but trusted weight. Behind her, the chamber sealed itself with an implacable hush, not cruel, just complete. Ahead, the ladder's final rung met stone. She pulled herself into a narrow landing where the hum condensed, and the dust hung like breath in winter light. She stood, chest against cool air and the folio's rectangle warm under her coat. Above and beyond, the intruders hesitated at a threshold they had not earned. The vault had lowered a path for one voice only. She took that as permission, not pride. The building, which had felt alive, felt purposeful now. Ladders don't lower by accident. She tightened her grip. The witness had her, and she had the record. The next room waited with its decision. As the landing narrowed, the corridor opened into a circular room held together by iron ribs and intention. The hum condensed to a single, steady heartbeat. In the center stood a pedestal of stone, its top carved like a shallow basin. Resting within were two iron cylinders, twins until the light named their difference. One engraved public custody, the other private continuity. Between them, a blueprint overlay lay under glass, transparent vellum inked with wells, schoolhouses, a burial ground, lines crossing like veins. The air smelled of oil, cedar, and decisions. She stepped closer. The cylinders were heavy with history, each engraved with a crest. The Split Circle River, the wheat chief now witness. Words etched along their rims offered no comfort. Public custody, immediate release, no negotiation. Private continuity, temporary stewardship, delay disclosure. Every instinct in her ribs leaned toward sunlight, yet the overlay warned her what sunlight might burn. If released now, the site would open and power would move to seize it under the flag of public safety. If delayed, the secret stayed safe, but secrets rot, even with good intent. The vault spoke without voice. A small lens opened in the wall, and a red line traced the blueprint, revealing how the legacies fund had been braided into necessities. Wells that fed the poor end of town, a school wing that never opened, a burial ground with names that had slipped their stones. Evidence didn't shout, it accumulated. The map held law like a net. Her throat tightened at the proof of a century's theft running beneath a daily walk. Footsteps scraped overhead, then paused, as if the intruders had reached a door that did not accept their breath. The vault had narrowed the path, so only her voice could make the last hinge turn. She rested her palm on public custody and felt the metal's cool argument. She lifted private continuity. It warmed to her skin like a listening animal, making a case for patience, leverage, a negotiation with people who counted silence as a currency. She had been taught that archives preserve what power forgets on purpose. She had also learned that delayed restitution becomes denial with nicer words. The lens flickered to a small notation in a corner of the overlay. Burial ground boundary disputed. She traced the line with her finger. Community names clustered beyond it like seedlings forced against a fence. Immediate transfer would unlock the barred exits above. Law would flood the site like thaw water. And law, for once, would be on the side of the ledger. She set private continuity back into the basin. It thudded, persuasive still. She held public custody again and felt nothing but weight. The vault did not promise safety. It offered burden. People, she had said in the echo room, and the oath came back like breath. She slid the public custody cylinder toward a keyed slot in the pedestal. The iron rim met the groove, paused, then sank as if recognizing the hand it wanted. Alarms woke like old birds startled from rafters, their calls not panic, but announcement. Above, something heavy unlatched. A chain ran, a bar lifted. Doors that had been sealed by private locks yielded to a public key. The building inhaled. The cylinder's engravings glowed faintly, wheat amber on iron. The overhead lights died without ceremony. The intruders had cut the power. The hum underfoot lowered to a heartbeat the ear could barely follow. Only the vault's inner pulse remained, and the small recorder in her coat ticked on, its battery faithful. The room's darkness was not empty. It was purposeful. A single thread of light traced the edge of the pedestal, a path for hands rather than eyes. She reached for the hand crank revealed by the cylinder's descent. It folded out from the pedestal like a tool that had been waiting for a grip with resolve. She took it, turned once. The sound it made was agricultural and ceremonial, gears somewhere deep, engaging like millstones brought back to work. With each rotation, drawers in far rooms unlatched. She felt it through bone. Index drawers releasing like seeds, splitting open in spring, one soft click at a time. Above, metal boots argued with stone. A voice she did not need to name spit a command. Then the command softened, wary. The vault's heartbeat did not change its pace to please fear. She cranked again, shoulders warming with labor. With each turn, the cylinder marked restored, stamped copies down a chute she hadn't seen, paper landing beyond her sight with disciplined thumps. The room made a simple promise, proof enough to scatter. Halfway through the arc, the crank stiffened. The vault tested her resolve with weight. She leaned into it, breath a metronome. The hum shifted slightly, an old machine's sympathy for human timing. She thought of the ledger's note. Find the bolts, fit the speech, make the ledger remember. This was the last fitting. The lens on the wall blinked one final image. Her field notebook stamped with the crest, the impatient initial in the margin. Custodian, not owner. She smiled without softness. Not blood. Duty. She turned the last quarter with hands that had opened stuck windows, lifted wet pages, pressed seals into wax in rooms no one visited. The crank reached its end and locked with a satisfied seashell click. The pedestal exhaled. A chute mouth opened near the floor, spitting a stack of stamped copies into a canvas tray. Restored, restored, restored. A panel slid open beside the tray. Within, a narrow satchel waited, embossed with the river crest. The vault thought of everything a body might need to carry what it had made. She slung the satchel across her shoulder, the weight honest and immediate. The heartbeat underfoot steadied to a post-labor calm. The room dimmed further, a gentle nudge. The decision had been made. Above, the building unbarred its own exits with a clatter like rain. She lifted the folio under her coat, tightened the strap of the satchel, and turned toward the corridor where the air smelled faintly of daylight leaking through rubble. The vault, which had asked for witness and offered debt, now offered a way out. Alarms stitched the distance into short, nervous seams. She tightened the satchel strap and moved. The corridor funneled her toward the stacks, where paper and stone made a maze that knew her gait now. The hum rode low, a guide rope. Proof pressed against her ribs, the folio's edge warm as breath, and the restored copies thudded soft in the bag like a second pulse. She kept one hand on the wall, fingers counting bolt heads, remembering turns by the coolness of iron. The intruders gathered to her path as if drawn by the same map. She heard them adjust from swagger to caution. Metal touched tile like teeth. She cut left through a bindery alcove, the air sharp with old glue. When she reached the long aisle of deeds, she paused, inhaled the smell of cold stone and ink, and read the stacks like streets. She sent the first packet down a gravity chute labeled Court Annex, triangle mark, oldest route. Paper slid away into dark, its destination a daylight doorway where it would arrive like a message thrown ahead of a retreat. A clatter answered behind her, steel on shelving, a body catching itself. She moved again, using the quiet between their breaths. The second chute yawned near probate, its mouth crusted with dust. She cleared it with her sleeve and fed more copies into its throat. The chute accepted with a hollow glide. Outside, some clerkless mail slot would cough them into morning. Evidence dispersed like seeds. A gate dropped without warning, teeth of steel grinning toward the floor. She had seconds. The ledger's brass plate, her talisman, her first whisper, caught the light. She kissed its spine, thanks for the guidance, then slid it under the gate's biting edge as a wedge. Metal screamed as weight met stubborn brass. The gate hesitated, shivered, and held long enough for a body and a breath. She flattened, squeezed through, the satchel scraping, the folio bruising her ribs, and rolled into the next aisle as the plate surrendered with a final groan. The sound lodged in her chest. Loss and use. A corridor ahead collapsed into debris, brick and ledgerboard fused by time. The clear route died there. She rerouted by smell, ink densest to the right, and slipped into a records room half-caved, daylight bleeding through a rib of timber. The old mail shaft stood open, a throat she had not trusted earlier. Now it looked like a thin truth. She bundled a sheaf, tied it with the satchel's spare cord, and lowered it down, listening for the soft thud of wood at the base. One by one, she fed proof to places that could not ignore stamped words. Boots found the room she had left, Voices hissed, less certain. She climbed the shaft's side rungs, knees biting rust, the satchel thumping her hip, the folio's corner a steady ache. At the top, a grate gave way under her shoulder. She spilled into a narrow hall that breathed dust out of a slit, like a prayer escaping. She followed the exhale to a cracked door and shouldered through. Dawn leaked into the courthouse ruin, thin and gray. Wind crossed the empty square and slipped through broken glass with a sound like old ribbon. Sirens, far off, threaded into the air. News of doors unbarred, traveling faster than men who had thought themselves in charge. The documents shivered in her arms, the paper reacting to cold like skin. She took the stair that still believed in itself and landed on a vestibule where counters once held pens on chains. She set a packet on the marble, spread the top page, and stamped it again with the ring's ghost, the way her palm remembered warmth. Restored glowed faintly where the light found it. She turned, listening. Below, the intruders reached the lower landing as the vault sealed itself with a final, implacable thud. The sound rolled up through stone, calm as a judge writing the last line of a verdict. Their voices bent with it. The vault had given them nothing. It had given her time. She crossed the ruin, slid through a gap where the door had warped, and stepped into morning. The square felt less like a wound and more like a record waiting to be read aloud. She tightened the satchel. Proof in hand, witness in breath, she walked toward the first mailbox, where a slot like a small mouth waited to speak the town's names back into light. She made the deliveries like a patient weather system. One packet slid through the Historical Society's brass mouth with a soft clack. Another tucked beneath the church office door, where the custodian's broom leaned like a sentinel. A third fed into the courthouse annex slot that still smelled faintly of ink and floor polish. Evidence dispersed like seeds at first thaw. She did not wait to watch anyone read. That was not her task. She left a trail the size of a century, then kept moving before someone decided that trails should be erased again. Her hands were scraped, her voice a rasp where witness had rubbed it raw. But the weight in her chest loosened. Not relief, resolution. She paused in the small square. Morning light found the restored stamp and turned it warm, wheat amber, the same tone the vault had breathed when it accepted her. Names that had once lived only in the dark now sat in open air. Silence felt less like absence and more like a held breath, ready to release. Without the ledger, her map was memory. The brass plate lay crushed under a gate's decision. She touched the empty place on her coat where the metal had pressed. Loss and use again. She smiled into the wind that moved across the ruin and made the broken windows hum at different pitches. The archive had lost an object and regained a voice. Her recorder ticked. The protocol's copy acknowledged receipt with a thin, bureaucratic chime. Then a vibration in her pocket, an automated notice, agnostic and perfect. Filing accepted. Timestamp within the legal day by a breath. She laughed once, not kindly, at the idea that law could be this gentle and this late in the same hour. Across the street, a single curtain twitched. Someone had seen her move and understood enough to stay quiet. She slipped another packet into a library book return, then another into a Union Hall's mail slot whose paint peeled in long scrolls, then another to the newspaper office whose windows had been cleaned yesterday for the first time in years. Proof proliferated. Her voice arrived at a rasped whisper when she spoke a thank you to the air, not to a person, to the witness. The building behind her exhaled through its cracks. She felt the hum recede into the foundations, not gone, only finished. The vault had done what a good clerk does. It asked the right question and recorded the answer. A final envelope remained, and addressed in a script that walked the line between haste and care. Custodian, next. She turned it over in her hands and did not open it. History is a relay, not a monument. She tucked the envelope into her coat's inner pocket, the same place the folio had warmed. Duty travels. A crow barked, then went quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a door groaned and unlocked itself. She looked toward the courthouse ruin and found its silhouette less ruined now, the way a face looks after someone recognizes it in a photograph and says the name aloud. She crossed the square and set the last bundle where school children would pass, on the steps of a building with a mural half finished. She pressed her palm to the top page one more time. The restored mark glowed faintly where the cold met the ink. Names had returned to daylight. The town would have to decide whether to read them out loud. Her hands shook now that the labor had ended. She flexed them and felt the grit of plaster and the ache of iron rungs printed into her skin. She could sleep. She would not. Not yet. One more errand. She walked the long block to a corner post where an old phone booth stood without a phone, a glass box that had become a shelter for flyers and missing cat notices. She taped a single page inside, an index of the first 5 names and a line beneath in plain type. Custodian declared service. People. Witness present. Contact for copies. Historical Society. No signature. No boast. Just a line, set like a ledger entry. The wind freshened. The courthouse ruin felt less like a wound and more like a record. The air thinned in that way it does when a storm has finally spent itself. She turned her collar up and walked. Before she left the square, her pocket buzzed again. This time not automated. A new message, terse. City clerk acknowledged receipt. Door bars lifted. Records room open to public. Counsel request guidance on custody procedures. She exhaled. That was the sound of power, remembering it had a job. She stood in the middle of the square and let the morning settle. Names that had been spoken in a locked room were now legible as weather. She felt very tired and very present. She lowered her head, as if taking dictation from air. Then she moved, because the next custodian would need a place to begin. The door clicked shut behind her. The square held its breath as the town's names warmed to the light. If this journey gripped you, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Join the Archivist girl as she unearths the next hidden truth. Don't miss the next chapter. Another vault waits, and its echo is already calling.